Rain hammered the tin roof of the New Jersey pier like 1,000 impatient fists. Jackson Vance stood at the edge of the loading dock, arms crossed, watching the harbor lights blur through sheets of water. His crew of 12 men sat slumped against crates and steel drums, jackets soaked through, faces tight with exhaustion. The cargo shipment that was supposed to arrive at 6 had been stuck offshore for 4 hours, and nobody had eaten since noon. Frank, his senior enforcer, rubbed his hands together for warmth. "Boss, the guys are running on fumes. We push through tonight. Someone's gonna make a mistake." Jax didn't answer right away. He knew Frank was right, but the shipment couldn't wait. Too much money, too many eyes watching to see if his operation could hold steady under pressure. He was about to radio the tugboat captain again when headlights cut through the rain at the far end of the warehouse. A battered white utility truck rolled to a stop near the loading bay. The driver's door opened, and Bella Vance stepped out, an umbrella tucked under one arm, struggling to balance 2 large insulated carriers against her hip. The men straightened up, confused. Nobody had called for a delivery. "Bella?" Jax jogged over, taking one of the carriers from her before she dropped it. "What are you doing out here? It's freezing." She shrugged, rainwater dripping from the edge of her umbrella. "You said the shipment got delayed. I figured nobody's eaten." Her voice was quiet, almost shy, the way it always was around his crew. She rarely came to the docks. She rarely came anywhere near his work at all. "I made pot roast. There's broth too, if anyone's cold." Jack stared at her for a second, unsure what to say. In 6 years of marriage, Bella had never once shown interest in his operations. She kept to their home, tended her garden, read in the evenings. He'd always assumed she preferred it that way, and honestly, he preferred it too. His world wasn't one he wanted her tangled up in. But here she was, soaked to the knees, hauling dinner to 20 tired men in the middle of a storm. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "I know." She smiled and walked past him toward the crew, setting the carriers down on an overturned crate. "But I wanted to." Frank was the first to approach, sniffing the air like a man who hadn't smelled real food in weeks. Bella opened the lid, and steam rolled out, carrying the smell of slow-cooked beef, rosemary, and something warm and buttery underneath. She'd brought bowls, a ladle, even a stack of cloth napkins tucked into a canvas bag. "Help yourselves," she said, stepping back to let the men crowd around. Frank took the first bowl. He blew on it once, took a bite, and stopped chewing altogether. His eyes went wide. He looked at the bowl, then at Bella, then back at the bowl like he was trying to figure out if it was real. He didn't finish the sentence. He just kept eating. One by one, the rest of the crew filled their bowls. The warehouse, usually filled with grumbling and the occasional curse about the weather, went almost completely silent, except for the sound of spoons scraping against metal. Jax watched from a few feet away, arms still crossed, but his expression had shifted from tired irritation to something closer to disbelief. He'd eaten Bella's cooking plenty of times at home. He knew she was good, but watching hardened men who'd stared down gun barrels without flinching go quiet over a bowl of pot roast was something else entirely. "Boss," one of the younger guys, Miguel, said between bites, "No disrespect, but this beats anything the catering company's ever brought us." A few of the others laughed, nodding in agreement. Frank, who'd already finished his first bowl and was reaching for seconds, pointed his spoon at Jax like he was making a formal declaration. "I'm serious. Whatever we've been paying for meals, cancel it. This is it now. This is the standard." Jax opened his mouth to brush it off, to remind them they had a shipment to track and a job to finish. but the words didn't come. He was too busy watching Bella move quietly between the men, refilling bowls, checking if anyone needed more broth, ducking her head slightly whenever someone thanked her, like the attention embarrassed her. She caught his eye once, briefly, and gave him a small, uncertain smile before turning back to the crew. Something shifted in Jax's chest, though he couldn't quite name it. He'd built his entire operation on control, on knowing every variable, every risk, every man's strengths and weaknesses. Bella had always been the one part of his life that existed outside of that world, untouched and separate. But standing there in the rain, watching his exhausted, battle-tested crew practically fight over a pot of stew his quiet wife had made, he realized he might have been wrong about something. Wrong about how separate those two worlds actually were. His phone buzzed in his pocket. The tugboat captain, finally, with news that the shipment had cleared and was 10 minutes out. Jax slipped the phone back into his coat without answering right away. 10 minutes. He had time. He walked over, took an empty bowl from the stack, and held it out toward Bella. "Any left for me?" Her smile widened, genuine this time, and she reached for the ladle. Behind them, the storm kept pounding the roof, but for the first time all night, nobody on that dock seemed to notice the cold. The tactical briefing was supposed to start at 7 sharp. Jax had said it twice the night before, once in person and once over the group line, so there'd be no excuses. He stood at the head of the long steel table inside the armory, a converted equipment warehouse lined with lockers and gun safes, and watched the clock tick past 7, then 7:15, then 7:20. 9 of his 12 men were present. Frank stood near the whiteboard, arms folded, jaw tight. The other 3 chairs sat empty. "Where's Miguel, Dale, and Ortiz?" Jax asked. Nobody answered right away. A couple of the men exchanged glances, the kind that told Jax they knew exactly where the missing 3 were, and none of them wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Frank finally sighed. "They're probably still parked outside your driveway, boss." Jax blinked. "My driveway? Bella makes those cinnamon rolls on Wednesdays. Word got around after the docks. Guys have been swinging by early, hoping she steps outside before they gotta head in." The room went quiet, in a way that made Jax's neck heat up, somewhere between annoyance and disbelief. He'd built this crew on discipline, men who showed up on time because a job that started late was a job that got somebody hurt, and now 3 of them were sitting in a car outside his house, waiting on baked goods like teenagers outside a bakery window. "Get them on the phone," Jax said. Frank already had his cell out. 2 rings, and Miguel picked up, sounding entirely too cheerful for a man who was late to a briefing. "Miguel, where are you?" Jax kept his voice level, though it took effort. "Almost there, boss. 5 minutes." A pause, muffled voices in the background, and then Miguel again, quieter. "Actually, might be 10. Bella just pulled a tray out. She's letting them cool a bit before she wraps some up for us." Jax pressed 2 fingers against his temple. "You are aware we have a briefing." Yeah, we know. We're coming. Just, she made an extra batch with walnuts, and Dale's allergic to walnuts, so we're waiting on the plain ones." Jax hung up without responding. He set the phone down on the table and looked around at the men still present, all of whom were doing a poor job hiding their amusement. "This is a joke to everyone?" Jax said. Frank shook his head, but there was something knowing in his expression, like a man watching his boss slowly catch up to something the rest of the crew had already figured out. "It's not a joke, boss. It's just, your wife's cooking does something to people. I don't know how to explain it any better than that. It's food, Frank. It's not just food." Frank pulled out a chair and sat, leaning back with the confidence of a man who'd thought this through already. You ever notice how quiet the docks were the other night? No complaining, no fighting over who does what shift. Everybody just ate and went back to work, calm as anything. That doesn't happen, not with this crew. Jax wanted to argue, but the memory of that rainy warehouse floor, the sudden hush that fell over 20 exhausted men, was still fresh enough that he couldn't dismiss it outright. He'd noticed it too. He just hadn't wanted to make it into something bigger than it was. 15 minutes later, Miguel, Dale, and Ortiz finally walked in, each carrying a small paper bag, faces sheepish but unbothered. Dale set his bag down on the table like a peace offering. "Sorry, boss. Genuinely. Won't happen again." He didn't sound especially convinced of his own promise. Jax stared at the three of them, then at the paper bags, then at the rest of the crew, who were already eyeing the bags with obvious interest, despite having eaten breakfast at home. He exhaled slowly and gestured at the whiteboard behind him. "Sit down. We've got a shipment schedule to go over, and I'd like to finish before lunch." The briefing continued, though Jax found himself distracted more than once, watching his men pass a bag of cinnamon rolls under the table like it was contraband, watching Frank sneak a bite between talking points about warehouse security. These were men who'd handled disputes with rival crews, who didn't rattle easily, who Jax had personally vetted for their ability to stay focused under pressure. And they were falling apart over pastries. After the meeting wrapped, Jax lingered by the table while the others filed out. Frank stayed behind, gathering a stack of files. "You're really going to have a problem on your hands if this keeps up," Frank said, not looking up from his papers. "What kind of problem?" "The kind where your crew starts making decisions based on her kitchen schedule instead of your orders." Frank finally glanced up, and there was no mockery in his face now, just quiet observation. "I've watched men do a lot of things for a lot of reasons. Money, fear, loyalty. Never seen them show up early for breakfast rolls before." Jax didn't have a response for that. He thought about Bella at home right now, probably already cleaning up the kitchen, unaware that her quiet Wednesday habit had turned 3 of his men into a security risk. It wasn't something he could put a stop to easily, not without hurting her feelings, and not without admitting that whatever she was doing in that kitchen had an effect on his crew that his own orders sometimes struggled to match. He grabbed his jacket off the back of the chair, mind already turning toward how he'd bring it up with her that evening, though he wasn't sure yet what he planned to say. All he knew was that something in the balance of his world had shifted, quietly, over the course of a few days, and he hadn't seen it coming until it was already sitting in front of him, wrapped in wax paper. The apartment was quiet when Jax got home, which usually meant Bella was reading in the armchair by the window or already asleep. Tonight, he found her in the kitchen instead, sleeves pushed up, sorting through a row of glass jars on the counter, each one labeled in her small, careful handwriting. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her work, before she noticed him. "Long day?" she asked without turning around. "Something like that." He loosened his tie and dropped his jacket over a stool. "Bella, can we talk for a minute?" She turned then, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her expression open and unguarded the way it always was with him. "Of course. What's wrong?" He wasn't sure how to start without it sounding like a criticism, because it wasn't one. Not really. He just needed her to understand what was happening on his end, the parts of his world she couldn't see from here. "The docks, the cinnamon rolls on Wednesdays," he said. "It's becoming a problem. Not because the food isn't good. It's too good. My guys are late to briefings. They're rearranging their whole morning around your kitchen. I had 3 men parked outside our driveway, waiting for breakfast instead of doing their jobs." He expected her to look hurt, maybe apologize, promise to scale it back. Instead, she just tilted her head slightly, like she was turning the problem over in her mind. "I didn't realize it was causing trouble," she said. "I can stop, if that's what you want." "That's not." He rubbed the back of his neck, frustrated with himself for not explaining it better. "I don't want you overworking yourself for a bunch of guys who should already know how to show up on time. That's my concern. You're out there hauling pots in the rain, baking before sunrise. I don't want it to become an obligation." Bella set the dish towel down and walked over to the pantry, pulling the door open. Inside, everything was arranged with a precision Jax had never really paid attention to before. Jars of dried herbs sorted by type, spices labeled and dated, shelves of preserved vegetables stacked in neat rows, each one clearly the product of hours of quiet, careful work. "This isn't an obligation to me," she said. "It's the opposite. Cooking is the one thing that quiets my head. You know how you feel when you're working through a shipment problem, figuring out the angles. That's what a recipe is for me. I like doing it. I like doing it for people who actually appreciate it." Jax looked at the pantry, then at her, seeing something he hadn't quite let himself notice before. This wasn't a woman quietly biding her time at home, waiting for him to come back from a world she wanted no part of. This was someone who'd built her own quiet discipline, her own version of control, just in a different language than the one he spoke. "You could have told me you enjoyed it this much," he said. "You never asked." She said it gently, without any bite to it, just an observation. "You've always kept this part of your life separate from me. I figured you wanted it that way, so I never brought up wanting to help. The docks just happened because I knew you were stuck, and I couldn't sit here doing nothing." He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, thinking back over the last few days. The warehouse floor gone silent, the steakhouse complaints he'd heard about secondhand from Frank. The three men outside the driveway, sheepish and unrepentant. He'd been so focused on the disruption that he hadn't stopped to consider what was actually happening underneath it. "Have you noticed anything different about the crew?" he asked, "since you started bringing food around?" Bella considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things, turning it over before answering. They seemed calmer. That first night at the docks, everyone looked exhausted and irritated when I got there. By the time they finished eating, nobody was complaining anymore. I don't know if that's the food exactly, or just having something warm after a long day. People soften up when they're fed properly. It's harder to stay angry or on edge with a full stomach. Jax hadn't thought about it in those terms before, but she wasn't wrong. He ran his crew on structure, discipline, clear chains of command. It worked, mostly, but there were always undercurrents of stress that never fully went away, the kind that built up over long shifts and tense negotiations and jobs that didn't go according to plan. He'd never had a tool for managing that particular kind of pressure. He handled logistics, contracts, threats. He'd never once thought to handle morale with a pot of stew. "You've been doing something I couldn't figure out how to do myself," he admitted. Bella smiled, a little surprised by the observation. "It's not strategy, Jax. I just like feeding people. Maybe not on purpose." He crossed the kitchen and stood beside her at the pantry, looking over the neat rows of jars again with new eyes. "But it's working like one." She didn't say anything to that, just reached up and straightened a jar of dried thyme that didn't need straightening. A small, self-conscious gesture that told him she wasn't sure what to do with the compliment. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Do you want me to stop?" Jax thought about Frank's warning from the armory, about men making decisions based on her kitchen schedule instead of his orders. It was a real concern, one he couldn't just wave away. But standing here now, watching her carefully close the pantry door, he realized Stopping her wasn't actually what he wanted at all. "No," he said slowly. "I think I want to understand it better first." The Marchetti Grill was the kind of place Jax normally reserved for closing deals, not celebrating them. Dark wood paneling, low lighting, a wine list longer than most contracts he signed. He'd booked the private back room for the evening to thank his crew for pushing through the delayed shipment without a single hitch, and he'd spared no expense doing it. Dry-aged steaks, top-shelf bottles, the works. He'd expected the night to be a victory lap. Instead, it turned into something closer to a slow, uncomfortable disappointment. Frank was the first to say something, though he tried to be diplomatic about it, pushing a piece of filet around his plate with obvious reluctance. "It's good, boss. Real good. Just," he set his fork down, "it's missing something. It's a $200 steak, Frank. I know what it costs." Frank glanced around the table, and Jax followed his gaze, noticing for the first time that half the crew had barely touched their plates. Miguel had pushed his mashed potatoes to the side. Dale was picking at a piece of asparagus like it had personally wronged him. "Nobody's finishing their food," Jax said, more to himself than anyone else. Ortiz, usually the quietest at the table, spoke up without much hesitation. "It's not bad, it's just fancy. You know? Everything's got a foam on it, or some kind of reduction. Bella's food, you don't need any of that. It just tastes like somebody actually cared when they made it." A few heads nodded around the table, and Jax felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with the wine. He'd spent nearly $4,000 on this dinner, and his crew was sitting here comparing it unfavorably to a home-cooked pot roast served out of insulated carriers in a rainstorm. "This is one of the best restaurants in the city," Jax said, aware even as he said it that he sounded defensive. "It is," Frank agreed quickly, not wanting to cause offense. "Nobody's saying it isn't good food. It's just different. Good. This place is good because some chef trained for 20 years to make it taste impressive. Bella's cooking is good because it tastes like somebody's actually thinking about you when they make it." "That's a different thing entirely." Jax didn't have a response for that. He looked down at his own plate, the steak cooked to a perfect medium rare, garnished with something green and delicate that he couldn't identify, and found that he understood exactly what Frank meant, even if he didn't want to admit it out loud. The restaurant manager, a stiff, immaculately dressed man named Perrault, appeared at the table a few minutes later, clearly having noticed the state of the half-eaten plates being cleared. His expression was tight, professionally polite, but visibly wounded. "Is everything satisfactory, Mr. Vance? If there's an issue with the preparation, I'd be happy to have the kitchen adjust." Jax glanced at his crew, most of whom suddenly found their wine glasses fascinating, avoiding eye contact with the manager. He didn't want to insult the man's kitchen, not after booking the entire back room and ordering nearly every high-end item on the menu. "Everything's fine," Jax said. "Long week. Nobody's got much of an appetite." Perrault didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded stiffly and retreated, leaving behind an atmosphere that felt considerably more awkward than it had 10 minutes earlier. By the time the crew left the restaurant, Jax had a headache building behind his eyes, not from the wine, but from the strange, unfamiliar sensation of watching an expensive gesture fall completely flat. He'd wanted to give his men something nice, something that reflected how well the operation had gone. Instead, he'd learned that his own reward system had somehow become obsolete, quietly replaced by a woman who'd never once asked to be part of any of it. Word moved fast in his circles, faster than Jax would have liked. By the following afternoon, Frank pulled him aside at the office with a look on his face that told Jax there was more bad news coming. "People are talking," Frank said. "Word's out that half the crew barely touched dinner at Marchetti's last night. Somebody mentioned it to one of Del Vecchio's guys, and now it's making the rounds that your men are turning their noses up at proper syndicate dining." Jax pinched the bridge of his nose. "It's a rumor about steak, Frank. It's not exactly a declaration of war. No, but it's the kind of thing that makes people ask questions. Makes them wonder what's really going on with your crew, whether there's some kind of internal problem nobody's talking about." Frank hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "People notice when a crew's discipline shifts, boss, even over something as small as this." Jax leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a long moment. He hadn't anticipated that a dinner meant to reward his men would end up as fodder for underground gossip, another small crack in the careful image he'd spent years building. He thought about Bella at home, likely unaware that her cooking had indirectly become a talking point among rival crews across the city. "So what do you want me to do about it?" Jax asked. "Ban my own wife from cooking so my men don't seem soft?" Frank shook his head slowly. "No, I think you're looking at this the wrong way." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "You've got something nobody else in this business has. Every other crew's running on fear and money. Yours is running on something people actually want to be near. That's not weakness, boss. That's leverage, if you're smart enough to use it right." Jax didn't answer right away, turning the idea over in his mind, the beginnings of a plan starting to take shape somewhere in the back of his thoughts, though he wasn't ready to say it out loud just yet. The call came in just after sunrise. Jax was still finishing his coffee when Frank burst into the office, phone already pressed to his ear, relaying updates from the terminal in short, clipped sentences. "Miller's guys blocked lane 4. Says he's not moving until we renegotiate the crossing fees." Frank hung up and looked at Jax. He picked the worst possible week to do this. We've got 3 shipments backed up behind his trucks. Jax grabbed his jacket. "Get the car. Vance, the hammer." Miller ran the rival operation out of the Brooklyn side of the harbor, and the two men had circled each other for years without ever quite tipping into open conflict. Miller was cautious, calculating, the kind of operator who tested boundaries slowly rather than all at once. Blocking a lane wasn't an act of war. It was a message, a way of reminding Jax that the crossing fees hadn't been revisited in 3 years, and Miller thought he deserved a bigger cut. By the time Jax arrived at the freight terminal, the scene had already drawn a small crowd of drivers and dock workers standing well back from the tension building between the two crews. Miller's men stood in a loose line in front of the blocked lane, arms crossed, unmoving. Jax's own crew had gathered on the opposite side, tense and ready, waiting for a signal. Frank fell into step beside him. "We could push through. We've got the numbers today. And start something we can't walk back from over crossing fees." Jax kept his voice low, watching Miller's men for any sign of movement. That's not the play. He could feel the pressure building around him, the kind of standoff that could tip either direction, depending on who blinked first. His men were exhausted, wound tight, from 3 days of back-to-back shipments, and Jax knew from experience that tired men made careless decisions under pressure. He needed a way to diffuse the situation without losing ground, and he needed it fast. Miller stepped forward from his line, hands in his coat pockets, unhurried. "Vance, nice of you to finally show up. I was starting to think you'd send one of your men instead." "You blocked my lane, Miller. You knew I'd come myself." Miller's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Figured it'd get your attention faster than another phone call. We need to talk numbers. Been a long time since we revisited the crossing rate." Jax kept his expression neutral, though internally he was doing the math on how much a delay today would cost him, how many calls he'd need to make to smooth things over with the clients waiting on their cargo. A standoff like this could easily stretch into hours, maybe longer, and every hour meant lost time his crew didn't have to spare. Behind him, he heard some of his men shifting restlessly, and one of the younger guys, Ortiz, muttered something under his breath about missing dinner if this dragged on much longer. It was a small comment, barely audible, but it caught in Jax's mind and refused to let go. He pulled Frank aside for a moment, keeping his voice low enough that Miller's crew couldn't hear. "What if we don't fight this at all?" Frank frowned. "You're not seriously thinking about giving him the rate increase?" "No." Jax glanced back toward Miller, who was watching them with the patient, unbothered expression of a man who had nowhere else to be. "I'm thinking about getting him to a table instead of a standoff, somewhere neutral, somewhere he doesn't feel like he needs an army standing behind him." "And how exactly do you plan on getting Vance Miller to sit down and talk peacefully? The man hasn't had a civil conversation with anybody outside his own crew in years." Jax was quiet for a moment, an idea forming that felt almost too simple to actually work. He thought about the docks 2 weeks earlier, about Frank's own men going silent over a pot of stew, about the steakhouse dinner that had fallen flat despite costing a small fortune. He thought about what Frank had said in his office just yesterday, about leverage nobody else in the business had. "Bella?" Jax said. Frank blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. "You want to bring your wife into a negotiation with Vance Miller?" "Not into the negotiation. Into the room before it." Jax kept his eyes on Miller, turning the idea over as he spoke it aloud, testing whether it held together. Invite him to a private dinner instead of a business meeting. No guns on the table, no crews standing around watching each other. Just food and a conversation that doesn't feel like either of us is trying to win something. Frank was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the idea against everything he knew about Miller's temperament. It's unconventional. So is blocking a freight lane over crossing fees instead of picking up the phone. Jax glanced at his men again, noting the exhaustion on their faces, the frustration simmering just below the surface. "We keep standing here. Somebody's going to say something they shouldn't, and then this turns into something neither of us can walk back." Frank finally nodded, though he still looked skeptical about how exactly a home-cooked dinner was supposed to resolve a business dispute that had been building for years. "I'll admit, boss, it's not the strategy I expected from you, but I've seen what happens to grown men over a bowl of her cooking. Maybe it's not as crazy as it sounds." Jax walked back toward Miller, who raised an eyebrow at the extended pause in their conversation. "Change of plans," Jax said. "Instead of hashing this out here in the middle of a freight lane with both our crews watching, why don't you come to my place next week? Private dinner. Just us. No numbers. No negotiating tactics. We'll talk crossing fees after." Miller studied him for a long moment, clearly trying to figure out the angle, the trick hidden somewhere in the offer. "That's not how you usually do business, Vance." "No," Jax admitted. "It's not. But I think you'll understand why once you're sitting at the table." The depot sat on the edge of town, a sprawling collection of stalls and warehouses where local farmers and specialty suppliers sold everything from heritage grain to cuts of meat that never made it to regular grocery stores. Jax had never set foot in the place before, but Bella navigated it like she'd walked the rows 100 times, stopping at a stand with aged cheeses, exchanging a few words with the vendor before moving on to examine a crate of tomatoes, still warm from the greenhouse. "You didn't have to come with me," she said, glancing back at him as she checked a bundle of fresh herbs. "I usually do this alone. I wanted to see where all of it comes from." Jax kept his hands in his coat pockets, feeling slightly out of place among the wooden crates and hand-lettered price signs. Figured I should understand the process if I'm going to ask you to feed a rival syndicate boss next week. Bella paused, a bunch of time still in her hand. You're really doing that? Inviting Vance Miller to the house? Riverfront safe house, not the house. But yes. He watched her expression carefully, expecting hesitation, maybe worry about hosting a man with Miller's reputation. Instead, she just nodded slowly, already turning over the logistics in her mind, the way she always did. What does he like to eat? Jax almost laughed at the question, at how naturally she skipped past any concern about danger and went straight to menu planning. I have no idea. Never had a meal with the man in my life. Then I'll need to find out. She moved toward the next stall, a butcher with a reputation for dry-aging beef longer than anyone else in the region, and began asking pointed questions about cuts and preparation that told Jax she was already 3 steps ahead of him. They spent the better part of the afternoon working through the depot, Bella selecting ingredients with a precision that surprised him. She rejected produce that looked perfectly fine to his untrained eye, explaining that the color wasn't quite right, or the texture would break down wrong under slow heat. She spent nearly 20 minutes debating with a vendor over the marbling on a roast before finally settling on one that satisfied her. You really think about all of this? Jax said as they walked back toward the truck with several bags of ingredients. It's the only way it works. She set the bags down carefully in the truck bed, arranging them so nothing would shift during the drive. People think cooking is just following steps, but it's really about paying attention, knowing what a person needs before they know it themselves. Jax leaned against the side of the truck, watching her work. Something about the conversation pulling at a thread he hadn't expected to find today. Where did you learn all this? You never talk much about it. Bella was quiet for a moment, closing the tailgate before answering. My grandmother, mostly. She raised me for a few years when my parents couldn't. She didn't have much, but she always found a way to make a meal feel like it mattered. I used to sit in her kitchen for hours, just watching her hands. She smiled faintly, a little self-conscious. Everything I make comes from her, one way or another. Recipes she never wrote down, just passed along by showing me. You never told me that. You never asked. She said it without any edge to it, the same gentle honesty she'd shown him during their conversation in the kitchen a few nights earlier. It's not a secret, Jax. It's just not something that ever came up. You've got your world, the docs, the numbers, the negotiations. This is mine. I never thought you'd be interested in where it came from. Jax considered that for a long moment as they climbed into the truck, the weight of her words settling somewhere he hadn't expected. He'd spent 6 years assuming Bella preferred to stay separate from his world, content in her quiet routines, and he'd never once stopped to ask what those routines actually meant to her, where they came from, what she carried with her into every dish she made. I want to understand more of it, he said, as she pulled out of the depot lot. Not just because of Miller. I mean generally. Bella glanced at him sideways, clearly surprised by the admission. That's not usually how this works between us. I know. He watched the depot shrink in the side mirror, thinking about Frank's comment from the armory, about leverage nobody else in the business had. But I've been thinking about it since the docks. You've been running something in that kitchen that does more for my crew's morale than half the incentives I've put together over the years. I didn't understand what it was until I started paying attention. It's not a strategy, Bella said again, echoing what she'd told him in the penthouse. I just want people to feel taken care of. Maybe not on purpose, Jax said, repeating his own words back to her with a small, knowing smile. But it works like one anyway. She laughed softly at that, shaking her head as she navigated the truck onto the main road toward home. For the rest of the drive, she talked through her plan for Miller's dinner, walking Jax through the courses she intended to prepare, the story behind each dish, the reasoning behind every choice. He listened more closely than he had in a long time, realizing somewhere along the way that he wasn't just gathering information to help smooth over a business dispute. He was, for the first time in years, genuinely curious about the woman sitting beside him and the quiet, careful world she'd built entirely on her own terms. The safe house sat back from the road behind a stand of old oak trees, its windows glowing warm against the dark water of the Hudson beyond. Jax had chosen the location deliberately, a property with enough history to feel neutral, far enough from either man's usual territory that neither side could claim home advantage. Miller arrived exactly on time, which Jax took as a small sign of respect, flanked by two of his men who positioned themselves near the entrance with the practiced stillness of people used to watching exits. Miller himself walked in slower, taking in the house with a careful, assessing glance, the kind of man who never fully let his guard down no matter how quiet the room seemed. "Nice place," Miller said, though his tone made it clear he was still waiting for whatever angle Jax had planned. "You said no numbers tonight." "No numbers," Jax confirmed. "Just dinner. We'll talk business after, if you're still interested." Miller's eyes narrowed slightly, but he followed Jax into the dining room without further protest. The table had been set simply, but well, low candlelight, a bottle of red wine already breathing near the center. Bella stood near the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on an apron, and offered a polite nod as the two men entered. "This is my wife, Bella," Jax said. "She'll be cooking tonight." Miller glanced at her, then back at Jax, clearly expecting some kind of catering staff, rather than the man's own wife handling the meal personally. "You're cooking, not just hosting?" "I like to cook," Bella said simply, without any defensiveness. "Please, sit. The first course will be out shortly." Miller took his seat slowly, still visibly wary, his eyes tracking Bella as she disappeared back into the kitchen. Jax poured the wine, and for a few minutes the two men sat in an uneasy silence, neither quite ready to make small talk with someone they'd spent years treating as a rival. Bella returned with the first course, a rich braised short rib that had been slow cooking most of the day, served over a bed of soft polenta with a dark reduction pooled around the edges. She set the plates down without fanfare and stepped back. Miller picked up his fork with the same guarded posture he'd carried since walking in, but the moment he took the first bite, something in his shoulders shifted. He chewed slowly, eyes flicking toward the kitchen, then back to his plate. "This is—" He stopped, cutting another piece, clearly trying to figure out what exactly had caught him off guard. "This is really good." "Bella spent most of the day on it," Jax said, watching Miller's reaction closely. "Slow braise. Takes patience." Miller didn't respond right away, too focused on the food, and Jax felt a small, private satisfaction at watching the same transformation happen that he'd witnessed with his own crew weeks earlier. The tension in Miller's jaw had eased. His hand, which had rested near his coat pocket when he first sat down, now moved easily, reaching for his wine without any hesitation. By the time Bella brought out the second course, a rustic vegetable soup with fresh sourdough she'd baked that morning, Miller had visibly relaxed into his chair, his guarded posture giving way to something closer to genuine ease. "You made this bread yourself?" Miller asked, tearing off a piece and studying the crust. "This morning," Bella said, refilling his water glass without being asked. "My grandmother's recipe. Takes about 6 hours with the proofing, but it's worth it." Miller broke off another piece, chewing thoughtfully. "I haven't had bread like this in 20 years. Not since my own grandmother passed. He said it quietly, almost to himself, a small crack of vulnerability that Jax hadn't expected to see from a man known across the harbor for his cold, calculating demeanor. Bella smiled gently at that. Then I'm glad I could bring some of it back for one night. The conversation shifted after that, easing away from the careful, guarded exchanges the two men had traded when Miller first arrived. They talked about the harbor, old stories from years back when both their operations were smaller and less complicated, moments of history neither of them usually brought up in front of the other. Jax noticed the shift happening gradually, the way Miller's answers grew longer, more relaxed, less like a man defending territory, and more like someone simply enjoying an evening. By the time the main course arrived, a roasted duck with a cherry glaze that Bella had spent the better part of the afternoon preparing, Miller had entirely abandoned the wary posture he'd walked in with. He laughed at something Jax said about an old shipment gone wrong years earlier, the kind of genuine laugh that Jax hadn't expected to hear from him in this lifetime. "I have to ask," Miller said, setting down his fork after finishing the duck. "How long has she been doing this?" "Cooking like this, I mean." "Since I've known her," Jax said, "but it's only recently that I've started paying attention to what it actually does." Miller nodded slowly, understanding something in that answer that he didn't press further. He glanced toward the kitchen, where Bella was quietly plating dessert, unaware of the conversation happening in her absence. "You're a lucky man, Vance," Miller said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the posturing he usually carried into any room with Jax. "Most people in this business, we don't get much of anything that feels like this. Feels normal, I mean. Feels like something worth holding on to." Jax didn't respond right away, turning the comment over in his mind, aware of how strange it was to be sharing something this honest with a man he'd spent years treating as a threat. He glanced toward the kitchen doorway himself, watching Bella carefully arrange a dessert plate with the same quiet focus she brought to everything, and found that for the first time in longer than he could remember, he agreed completely with what Miller had just said. Bella brought dessert into the library instead of the dining room, a plum tart still warm from the oven, its edges glazed and slightly caramelized where the sugar had bubbled over. She set the plate down on the low table between the two leather chairs, where Jax and Miller had settled, along with 2 glasses of something amber and unlabeled that Jax kept for occasions that called for more than wine. "I'll leave you two to it," she said, and slipped out quietly, closing the door behind her. Miller cut into the tart, took a bite, and closed his eyes for a moment before speaking. "Your wife could end wars with this, Vance. I mean that." Jax allowed himself a small smile, pouring 2 glasses from the decanter on the side table. "Let's find out if she can end this one." Miller set his fork down, the shift in his posture noticeable now that the conversation had turned toward business. But it wasn't the same guarded, calculating stance he'd carried into the house 3 hours earlier. He leaned back into the chair, more relaxed, more willing to actually listen rather than simply wait for his turn to push back. "The crossing fees," Miller said. "You know why I pushed on that. Because you think you're getting short-changed on volume through the Brooklyn lanes." Jax handed him a glass. "I've seen the numbers, Miller. You're not wrong to bring it up. I just didn't appreciate you blocking my freight to make the point." Miller took the glass, turning it slowly in his hand. "Would you have taken the meeting if I'd just called and asked?" Jax considered the question honestly. "Probably not as quickly. We've spent years circling each other without much reason to sit down like this." "That's exactly my point." Miller took a sip, studying Jax over the rim of the glass. "Every time I've tried to talk terms with you in the past, it's been through intermediaries, lawyers, half-written agreements neither of us fully trusted. I blocked the lane because I needed you to actually show up instead of sending someone else to handle it. Jax nodded slowly, understanding the logic, even if he didn't love the method. Fair enough. So let's talk terms properly, now that I'm here. They spent the next hour working through the numbers, the crossing fees, the volume splits, the maintenance costs for the shared sections of dock that both operations relied on. It was slower than Jax expected, both men taking time to actually explain their reasoning rather than simply posturing for position, something that rarely happened in negotiations of this kind. Miller, for his part, seemed genuinely willing to compromise in a way Jax hadn't anticipated walking in. "I'll adjust the crossing rate," Jax said eventually, "but I want a guarantee on lane priority during peak shipping weeks. No more surprise blockades." Miller extended his hand without hesitation. "Done. And for what it's worth, Vance, I'd rather have this arrangement with you than keep fighting over inches of dock space for the next 5 years." They shook on it, the kind of handshake that carried actual weight behind it, not the empty formality Jax was used to trading with men who smiled while looking for an angle to exploit later. He believed Miller meant it, and that belief alone felt like a rarer thing in his line of work than the agreement itself. Miller reached for the last piece of tart, finishing it off before setting his fork down with something close to reverence. 20 years, he said again, shaking his head slightly. "I haven't had a meal like this in 20 years. My grandmother used to make something similar, though she'd never admit anyone else's cooking came close to hers. I think tonight might change her mind, if she were still around to taste it." "I'll let Bella know," Jax said. "She'll appreciate that more than you'd think." Miller stood, straightening his jacket. The careful, guarded man who'd walked in 3 hours earlier, now noticeably absent. "You know, I came here tonight expecting to spend the whole evening trying to figure out what trick you had planned. Half of Brooklyn thinks you're smart enough to bury a man in paperwork before he even realizes he's been outmaneuvered. And what do you think now?" Miller glanced toward the closed door, beyond which Bella's quiet footsteps could be heard moving through the kitchen. "I think the smartest thing you've ever done had nothing to do with paperwork at all." He left a few minutes later, his men falling into step behind him as they walked out to the car, the tension that had followed them through the freight terminal 12 days earlier entirely gone. Jack stood at the window, watching the taillights disappear down the long gravel drive, the crossing fee dispute resolved without a single threat exchanged, without either side losing face or ground they weren't willing to give. Bella appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, still in her apron, watching him with a curious expression. "How did it go?" "We signed the deal," Jack said, turning to face her. "No threats, no posturing. Just talked it through like reasonable people." "That's good," she said, though there was something hesitant in her voice, like she wasn't sure whether to ask the question sitting behind her eyes. "Did it have anything to do with the food?" Jax crossed the room and took her hand, something he didn't do often enough, given how much of his life ran on careful distance and control. "It had everything to do with the food, Bella. Miller sat down tonight, ready for a fight, and he left talking about his grandmother. I don't know how you do that, but whatever it is, it just quietly settled something that's been building between our two operations for years." Bella looked down at their joined hands, quiet for a moment before answering. "I just wanted him to feel welcome. That's all I was trying to do." "I know," Jack said. "That's exactly why it worked. By the time word of the Miller truce reached the wider harbor community, it had already been reshaped into half a dozen different versions, each one stranger than the last. Some said Jax had paid Miller off quietly to avoid a war. Others claimed Miller had backed down out of fear after hearing rumors about Jax's growing influence. Frank, who fielded most of the calls that came into the office that week, found the actual truth far more amusing than any of the rumors circulating. "You'll want to hear this one," Frank said, dropping into the chair across from Jax's desk. "Del Vecchio's crew is telling people Miller signed the deal because you had blackmail on him. One of the dockhands swears he heard it from a reliable source." Jax didn't look up from the shipment ledger he was reviewing. "And the truth is a plum tart." "The truth is a plum tart," Frank confirmed, grinning. "Nobody's going to believe that version, though. Doesn't fit the story people want to tell about you." Jax set the ledger aside, more interested in what Frank had actually come in to discuss than the gossip circulating through the underground. "What's the real reason you're here?" Frank's grin faded slightly, replaced by something more measured. "You've got a line forming outside your office. Boss, the outer district guys, the ones who work the smaller routes out toward Newark and the southern terminals. They heard about the docks, the Miller dinner, all of it. They want in." "In on what, exactly?" "Bella's kitchen." Frank said it plainly, without any embarrassment now, as though the strangeness of the situation had simply become normal over the past 3 weeks. "They're saying the Inner Harbor crew's been eating better than anyone else in the operation, getting treated to home-cooked meals while the rest of them are stuck with vending machines and gas station coffee. They want a rotation. Everybody gets a turn." Jax rubbed his temple, feeling the particular kind of headache that came from managing a problem he never would have anticipated needing to manage. He walked to the window overlooking the loading yard below, where a cluster of men from the outer district crews had indeed gathered near the entrance, waiting with the patient determination of people who weren't planning to leave until they got an answer. "How many of them are out there?" "About 15. And that's not counting the ones who sent Frank." Frank stopped himself, correcting the slip. "Sent messages through other guys asking me to bring it up on their behalf." Jax exhaled slowly, watching the men below shift their weight, glancing occasionally up at the office windows. 3 weeks ago, his biggest concern had been shipment delays and turf disputes with rival operators. Now he was managing what amounted to an internal morale crisis over who got access to his wife's cooking. "This is absurd," Jack said, though there wasn't much heat behind it. "Maybe," Frank said, "but it's also not nothing, boss. Think about what's actually happened over the last 3 weeks. Your crew's tighter than it's ever been. Nobody's complaining about hours. Nobody's dragging their feet on shifts. The Miller situation resolved without a single shot fired, without a single dollar lost, to a prolonged standoff. All of that traces back to one thing." Jax turned from the window, considering the weight of what Frank was saying. He'd built his operation on strict hierarchy, on incentives measured in money and territory, and respect earned through results. He'd never had to account for something as intangible as morale, built entirely around a woman who'd never asked to be part of any of it, who'd simply wanted to feed people because it quieted something in her own mind. "I can't have every crew member showing up at my house expecting dinner," Jack said. "That's not sustainable, and it's not fair to Bella. She's not running a restaurant." "No," Frank agreed. "But maybe there's a version of this that works without burning her out." Jax walked back to his desk, sitting down heavily, turning the problem over the way he would any other logistics issue. The demand was real. The outer district crews weren't going to simply forget about it because it was inconvenient for him to manage. And beneath the inconvenience, there was something valuable happening that he didn't want to lose by mishandling it. "I need to talk to her," Jax said finally. "This isn't something I can decide on my own. It's her time, her energy. If we're going to figure out some kind of rotation, some way to make this fair without running her into the ground, she needs to be the one setting the terms." Frank nodded, standing to head back out and deal with the crowd still waiting near the entrance. "What do you want me to tell the guys outside?" Jax considered the question for a moment, thinking about the strange, unplanned momentum that had built over the last 3 weeks, starting with a rainy night at the docks and somehow ending with a peace treaty over roasted duck and homemade bread. None of it had followed any strategy he would have designed himself, and yet here he was, watching it reshape his entire operation from the ground up. "Tell them I'm working on something," Jax said. "Tell them to be patient, and it'll be worth the wait." Frank left the office, and Jax sat alone for a long moment, staring at the ledger he'd abandoned earlier, no longer particularly interested in shipment numbers. His mind was already elsewhere, turning over ideas, trying to figure out how to give his crew what they wanted without asking Bella to sacrifice the quiet, careful life she'd built for herself. Somewhere in that problem, he suspected, was the beginning of something bigger than he'd originally intended, though he wasn't yet sure exactly what shape it would take. The property sat along a quiet stretch of coastline north of the city, 3 acres of open land backing onto the water, a place Jax had acquired months earlier, for reasons that had nothing to do with cooking or crew morale. He'd planned to use it eventually for something related to logistics, maybe a private meeting space, maybe nothing at all beyond an investment. Standing on the grounds now, with a set of blueprints tucked under his arm, he saw a different use for it entirely. He'd spent the last 4 days working with a contractor he trusted, someone who'd built commercial kitchens for restaurants across the city and understood exactly what it took to run one at scale. Together, they drafted plans for a space attached to the main house, a professional kitchen with the kind of equipment Bella had never had access to, along with a dining pavilion large enough to seat 30 people comfortably, with room to expand if it ever needed to. He hadn't told Bella any of it yet. Part of him worried she'd see it as pressure, an expectation that her quiet hobby needed to become something formal and demanding. But he'd thought it through carefully, turning the idea over the same way he approached any major decision in his business, and he believed there was a version of this that gave her more freedom, not less. The contractor met him at the site that morning, walking him through the nearly finished structure. Stainless steel counters gleamed under the natural light pouring through a wall of windows facing the water. A walk-in pantry sat at the back, already stocked with shelving that mirrored the careful, organized system Bella kept at home, just on a much larger scale. "She's going to need staff if she's serious about running this at any real capacity," the contractor said, running a hand along one of the counters. "Even 2 or 3 people to help with prep and cleanup would make a difference." "I've already got a few names in mind," Jax said. "People from the neighborhood, a couple of retired line cooks who've done catering work before." "Nothing decided yet. I wanted her to have final say on all of it." He spent the rest of the morning walking the grounds alone after the contractor left, imagining how it would look finished, populated, alive with the kind of quiet, purposeful energy Bella brought to everything she touched. He thought about Frank's comment from weeks earlier, about leverage nobody else in the business had, and realized somewhere along the way that this had stopped being about leverage entirely. It had become about giving her something that matched the scale of what she'd already been doing, quietly, without complaint, without ever asking for recognition. That evening, he brought her to the property without explaining much beyond wanting her opinion on something. She walked beside him up the gravel path, curious but patient, the way she always was when he asked her to trust him without giving her the full picture first. When they reached the kitchen, she stopped in the doorway, taking it in slowly. The stainless counters, the professional ovens, the pantry stocked and organized, The dining pavilion visible through the far windows, empty now, but built to hold far more people than their small apartment kitchen ever could. "Jax," she said quietly, her voice caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. "What is this?" "It's yours," he said. "If you want it." She stepped further into the space, running her hand along one of the counters, the same way the contractor had, though her expression carried something entirely different, somewhere between overwhelmed and uncertain. "I don't understand. I was just making food for the guys at the docks." This is a restaurant. It's whatever you want it to be." Jax stayed near the doorway, giving her space to process the room on her own terms. The outer district crews have been asking for a rotation, wanting equal access to meals the way the inner harbor guys have had for weeks now. I could have just told them no, kept things the way they were. But I kept thinking about what you said, about cooking being the thing that quiets your head. I didn't want to turn that into an obligation by forcing more people on you without giving you the tools to actually manage it. Bella walked slowly through the kitchen, opening the walk-in pantry, running her fingers over the empty shelving, waiting to be filled with the same careful order she kept at home. "You built all of this without asking me first." "I know," Jax admitted. "I wanted to have something real to show you, not just an idea. If it's not what you want, we don't have to use it. I can sell the property, turn it into something else entirely. This isn't me telling you what to do with your time." She turned to face him, something shifting in her expression, the uncertainty giving way slowly to a kind of quiet wonder he hadn't seen from her before. "You really thought about all of this? The staff, the rotation, giving me a say in it. You built something out of nothing," Jax said. "A quiet habit that ended up holding my entire crew together better than any incentive I ever put together myself. You deserve a space that actually matches what you've been doing, not one that just happened by accident in our kitchen at home." Bella crossed the room and stood beside him, looking out through the wide windows toward the water, the dining pavilion catching the last light of the evening sun. "I'll need to think about the staff, who I'd want working alongside me, and I'd want to keep some control over the menu, not just cook whatever's requested." "It's entirely yours to run," Jax said. "I just wanted to build the space. Everything inside it is your decision." She was quiet for a long moment, taking in the room one more time, and when she finally looked back at him, there was something settled in her expression that hadn't been there before. A quiet confidence Jax had rarely seen from her outside the walls of their own small kitchen. "Then I think I'd like to say yes," she said. 5 days had gone into preparing the Harbor Grand Hall for its first real gathering, and by the time the doors opened that evening, Bella barely had a moment to catch her breath before the first guests started arriving. She stood at the pass, checking plates as they left the kitchen, flanked by the 2 retired line cooks she'd hired the week before, and a young prep cook named Sophia, who'd shown up on the first day of interviews with a notebook full of her own family recipes, eager to learn. The dining pavilion, empty and echoing just a month earlier, now buzzed with conversation and the low clatter of dishes. Long tables ran the length of the room, draped simply, lit with strings of warm bulbs overhead. Jax's inner harbor crew filled one section, the outer district guys who'd spent weeks lobbying for their turn filled another, and scattered among them, unexpectedly, sat several of Vance Miller's own men, invited at Miller's own request once he'd heard about the gathering. Miller himself arrived a little after 7, dressed down from his usual sharp suits, looking more relaxed than Jax had seen him in years of cautious dealings across the harbor. He found Jax near the entrance, extending a hand. "Didn't think I'd be back here again so soon," Miller said, But when I heard your wife built herself a proper kitchen, I wasn't about to miss the opening night." "Glad you came," Jax said, and meant it. The meal unfolded slowly across several courses, the way Bella had planned it. Each dish, rooted in something she'd learned from her grandmother, adapted now to feed a room of nearly 60 people, instead of a handful gathered around a small table. Roasted meats, slow-simmered stews, fresh bread pulled straight from the ovens Sophia had been tending all afternoon. The room grew louder as the night went on, laughter carrying between tables that would never have shared space peacefully a month earlier. Frank found Jax near the back of the hall partway through the evening, watching the room with a satisfaction he rarely allowed himself to show this openly. "Never thought I'd see the Day 2 rival crews sat at the same table without anybody checking for exits." "Neither did I," Jax admitted. "You know what the real twist is in all this?" Frank said, nodding toward the kitchen, where Bella could be seen through the pass, laughing at something Sophia had said while plating dessert. "Everybody in this business spends years building leverage through fear. Contracts, threats, favors owed. You built the strongest thing I've ever seen in this harbor, and it didn't cost you a single bullet or a broken promise. It cost you nothing but letting your wife do what she already loved doing." Jax didn't have an argument for that, mostly because he'd already come to the same conclusion himself over the past several weeks. He thought back to that first rainy night at the docks, how small and simple it had seemed at the time, just a woman bringing dinner to a tired crew because she couldn't stand the thought of them going hungry. He hadn't planned any of what followed. He'd simply paid attention and let it grow into something neither of them could have predicted. Later in the evening, once most of the plates had been cleared and the room had settled into the easy, unhurried rhythm of people who'd eaten well and had nowhere urgent to be, Bella finally stepped out from the kitchen, untying her apron as she crossed toward the main table where Jax sat with Frank and a few of the senior crew. Someone near the back of the hall noticed her first, and within moments, the entire room had turned, glasses raised, a low cheer rising up that grew louder as more people caught on. Bella stopped short, clearly not expecting the reaction, her cheeks coloring as the sound swelled around her. "To Bella," Frank called out, standing with his glass raised high, "for feeding this whole waterfront back to sanity." The room erupted into applause. Men who'd spent years defined by suspicion and calculated distance, now openly cheering for a woman who'd never once asked for any of it. Bella looked overwhelmed, glancing toward Jax with an expression caught somewhere between embarrassment and quiet joy. Jax stood and crossed to her, taking her hand and guiding her to the seat beside his own at the head of the table. She sat down slowly, still catching her breath from the surprise of it all, and beneath the table, out of sight from the rest of the room, Jax found her hand and held it. "You did all of this," he said quietly, "just for her. I just built the walls around it." "You saw something I didn't even know I was doing," Bella said. "That's not nothing, Jax." He watched the room settle back into its easy rhythm, conversation rising again, glasses clinking, the tension that had defined his world for years, now nowhere to be found, among the crowd gathered under the warm lights of the hall. Miller sat a few seats down, deep in conversation with one of the outer district crew leaders, the two men trading stories like they'd known each other for decades instead of weeks. None of it had started as strategy. It had started as a rainy night, an insulated pot of stew, and a woman who simply couldn't bear the thought of tired men going hungry. Somewhere along the way, without either of them planning it, that quiet instinct had rebuilt the entire foundation of Jax's world, turning fear and careful distance into something closer to a family gathered around a shared table. Jax held Bella's hand a little tighter under the table, watching his crew, his former rivals, and the woman who'd quietly changed everything, all sharing the same room in a peace nobody could have predicted a month ago. Whatever came next for the harbor, he knew now it would start here, at this table, built on nothing more complicated than a full plate and a little bit of care.